Well, look, I think it's prudent. This is a way that passengers can protect themselves and also reduce the risk to others on the airplane. There's a limited number of things that you can do as a passenger. This is one of them. I think it's prudent of the airlines to try to require these masks. They can't mandate it across the board. But as Phil LeBeau said, they can limit the ability of passengers to travel if they're non-compliant with this policy. Quality of masks matters, so if you can get your hands on a better quality mask, you're going to be better protected. But the masks do reduce your risk of contracting COVID. I think ultimately the risk to individual passengers on a plane is low right now, and that's because the prevalence of infection around the country is low, and the risk is going to rise and fall with what the ultimate prevalence of infection is in the background.
You think it's better to have one uniform policy, say from the FAA or the National Transportation Safety Board, that all of the airlines and all passengers have to follow, rather than once again leaving it to the individual entities to make their own decisions?
Well, the passengers have looked to the FAA to put in place uniform standards, for example, around fever checks. I'm not sure that the FAA is going to step in a timely fashion or wants to step in to mandate mask wearing. So the airlines are going to have to take some of these measures upon themselves. The airlines traditionally have never competed on safety. I think it's incumbent upon them to try to come together and put in place uniform safety measures across the industry. And this is one place where I think they should be working together. Let me
switch our attention now to what is our top story tonight, and that is this potential breakthrough called groundbreaking, really, in the fight against COVID-19. A steroid that is not new. It's been around for a long time, but in a study was shown to be effective. Can you comment on what this means and how we should think about the fight against this virus?
Well, it's a very significant finding. The addition of dexamethasone, an old steroid, in a large trial done in the United Kingdom and involved 11,000 patients, demonstrated that it could cut death of patients who are on ventilators by a third and cut the death rate of patients who require oxygen, so who are sick but don't require intubation, by 1/5. This is a very meaningful finding, a very meaningful effect from the addition of just a simple intervention, which is a single drug. COVID has two phases to it, essentially. The first is the viral response phase. It's the typical viral syndrome. You get a fever, you get a cough. A lot of people recover after that viral response phase, but some people go on in the second or third week to develop an inflammatory phase, and that's really the immune system's response to the virus, and you develop inflammation in your body, particularly in your lungs, and it's that inflammatory phase that gets people in trouble. Those are the patients developing what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome and requiring hospitalization and oxygen in the hospital or intubation. And so this steroid treats that inflammatory response. We've long known that drugs that can interfere with that inflammatory response potentially could provide benefit, but we didn't think steroids could do it. And so doctors were experimenting with a lot of different drugs. So this is a very significant finding today.
What does it also say about the way that the virus was treated from the very start?
Well, I think what's going to happen if we do have a second round of this virus in the fall is I think we're going to see death rates fall. We've learned how to treat this virus much more effectively. The addition of this drug is going to certainly make a difference on hospital mortality. If you look at some of the New York City hospitals, once you got on a ventilator, the death rate was around 50%. In-hospital mortality for COVID patients, once they were hospitalized, was about 20%. And so a lot of patients were succumbing to this infection once they became hospitalized. We're going to preserve much more life in the hospital, not just from the addition of this drug, but other interventions. So, for example, the anticoagulation, blood thinners that are now being used pretty widely are going to also reduce death, because what we found is a lot of people who decompensate from COVID infection actually are developing blood clots to their lungs, and that's what's causing them to rapidly decline.
What about remdesivir? Is this used in lieu of that? Can they be used together? How should we be thinking about that?
I think ultimately they could potentially be used together. These drugs work very differently. Remdesivir acts directly on the virus. This acts on the inflammatory response from the virus. I mean, in an ideal setting, you would postulate that remdesivir would be used early in the course of the infection to prevent viral replication and reduce the amount of virus in the body. And then if you go on to develop this inflammation, then you would add this drug to reduce that inflammation. So potentially these two drugs could be used in combination to reduce death and disease from COVID.
And this steroid we're talking about, the significance of it in the sense of going back to work, trying to get the economy back at full speed, if you can eliminate the prospects of either death or ventilator from the equation, that seems to be an extraordinarily significant development for most people.
I think if we reduce the death rate from COVID, which I believe we will, I think that's going to give more people confidence to go about their lives, not take unnecessary risks, but you have to take some risk if you're going to re-engage in the economy with COVID circulating in the background. If we know that we could preserve life through more advanced medicine, that's going to give more people confidence to re-engage.
I want to ask you about an op-ed that's in the Wall Street Journal tonight by the vice president, where Mr. Pence says panic about a, quote, second wave of the virus is, in his words, overblown. Do you share those thoughts?
Well, we're certainly not in a second wave right now. What we're seeing in states like Texas, Arizona, Alabama, Florida, Georgia is basically outbreaks. This is really the first wave of the virus. These are states that were never that heavily affected. Now they're seeing an upsurge in cases as they reopen. Texas announced today that they're going to step in and take some actions in the city of Austin. The governor's counseling people to stay at home a little longer. So they're recognizing they have a problem, and they'll probably slow their reopening and take some targeted mitigation steps. But this is really the first wave. The risk is a second wave in the fall. The risk is that as we get into September and October and we reopen in earnest, schools are back in session, colleges are, people come back from summer vacation and go back into the office setting, that's when we really risk a second wave. And as we enter the flu season, the fall and the winter. And so that risk is pretty significant. If I was probability adjusting, a second wave that was potentially worse than the first in terms of overall impact, I think you need to give that pretty reasonable odds, at least a third, at least 30% odds that we can experience a second wave just looking at the contours of this virus. A very small percentage of the country has been affected at this point, only about 5 to 7%. So this virus has a ways to go. This is a virus that by its own contours and characteristics, wants to infect 50 or 60% of the population, and it's going to try.